Yes, very warm welcome to this second program of our Forum on European Culture, a culture of democracy. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to welcome Tino Sehgal, one of the most influential and interesting artists at this moment, I would say. And as an artist, he focuses on the relationship between the artwork, the spectator, and the institution. And he doesn't make material artworks, but creates lived experiences, as he sometimes calls it, constructed situations, in which the audience actively participate or engage. His artistic practice has been shaped by his studies, partly by his studies in dance and economics, and we cannot think of art outside the economic system, as it's always a reflection of our economic reality. He created his performances as his performative works of art all over the world, and among others, Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam for a year here in 2015, but also the Guggenheim Museum in New York or the Venice Biennale in I think 2005, I think it was. This is so contemporary at the Pavilion, which was a wonderful piece of art. I was so amazed by it that you could be so cheered up by modern art that. And we've been in contact and in conversation over the past weeks and months about this evening. Tino Sehgal is going to take the floor for a longer while and give a lecture. But I wanted to introduce a little bit, why we're having this conference and why we asked Tino Sehgal to come and why we're so happy that he did. We're talking about culture of democracy. And why did we choose that phrase? Of course, because it's not that Europe is so democratic always. You could easily say that Europe has a culture of imperialism, and which is, of course, the other side, the flip side of the coin. And whether it's still going the democratic way or the imperialistic way, we don't know, of course. And it's sort of a pledge that let's hope that there's a culture of democracy. And the culture of democracy is, of course, not something which is done only by elections. It has to do, of course, a lot with institutions and rule of law, but it has to do with the citizens and whether you internalize that culture of democracy, and whether enough people in a society actually believe in the things of democracy, because you can write laws and you can have rule of law, but it doesn't really stick if not enough people internalize it. So it's a cultural thing. It's a pledge for the future instead of a description of the past. Because if you look at the past, we could easily say that we have a culture of imperialism, of racism, of colonialism. So you could easily say that, of course. And I think for a culture of democracy, of course, it's very, very important. I would always say that there's sort of 5 prerogatives to, in order for a rule of law and a democratic society to survive. And some of them are self-evident and others are less evident. One of them, I would say, is free elections, of course. The other is an independent judiciary. Well, we know that. Monopoly on the legal use of force is something which is overlooked sometimes, but that's a prerogative. But then there's free press. Well, we know that. If dictators wants to rule, the first thing they do is actually get rid of the free press. A lot of them, that's sort of the easiest way in. But then there's a 5th one, which is, I think, always overlooked, and that's the possibility and the assurance and the right to be present in each other's presence, to sort of meet each other, to be able to meet each other in the physical realm. And that's always overlooked, I would say, as a prerogative for a free society, a democratic society. And well, why is that important? Well, it came to light in many, many ways, but also I think during the pandemic, when it came to light that the parliament wasn't able to pass laws if they did it by Zoom. They had to be, by constitution, had to be there, actually be in each other's presence. Well, that's a coincidence. That's, of course, not a coincidence. It's part of a democratic system that you meet each other and you see each other. And actually, if you look it up in the history of democracy, of course, the Greeks, where a lot of it comes from, you had to declare yourself and be present in order to participate in the democratic system. I think this thing of coming together becomes more and more important for a culture of democracy. It stems also, from the internet, where, we spend much of our time nowadays touching some little piece of glass and thinking that we're actually interacting with something which we could call reality, which might not even be the case. It might not be the case for already quite a while, but now that we've introduced AI, we don't actually know whether we meet somebody there who is actually really there or isn't, because it can generate some person that you even might know, and it's totally synthetic and fake. So the only remedy for that, of course, is meeting somebody in the flesh and meeting somebody face to face. So it's a prerogative for a culture of democracy. And the interesting thing, many interesting aspects of your work, but one of the interesting aspects is from 2000 onwards, you don't produce artifacts, but situations, which is in each other's presence. And the importance of that, I don't think that was so clear in 2000. I think after the pandemic and after, you've experienced the social media hype, it suddenly becomes clear that it was a real amazing vision. That it is sort of the essence of a lot of and the answer, the antidote to a lot of the anti-democratic things we're experiencing, actually, at the moment. And I think because we have a tank here outside, and that's a symbol maybe of the imperialism of... but the real danger for democracy comes normally from within. And from within might be also coming from the use of these sort of artifacts. I think Yuval Noah Harari said an interesting thing about that. He said recently in The Economist, he wrote that we just recently encountered a foreign, an alien intelligence on our planet, which is AI. And AI can, actually I wrote it down, and he said, I think it's very concise. He said, democracy is a conversation. Conversations rely on language. When AI hacks language, think of ChatGPT, or when it hacks language and can talk to us out of our screen, it could destroy our ability to have meaningful conversations, and thereby destroying democracy. And I think the answer to that, for a big part, is of course being present, and the artists being present, or being present with each other, like we are here today now. So I think that was, for us, a main reason to be very, very happy that you agreed to come along and have a conversation on these aspects of a culture of democracy and of your work. So a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for coming along. And Tino Sehgal.
Yeah, Yuri, thank you for inviting me. I'm always excited to be able to speak in a broader setting, which is not, let's say, solely focused on contemporary art. And thank you for choosing to spend your Thursday evening here in this room. So maybe before I start, I can say some thoughts that I had while you were talking. No, like,
yeah.
I think when you made your points about what constitutes a functioning democracy, I think I'm not an expert on Habermas or something, but like there needs to be a public sphere for there to be like a public discourse, a public debate around values, because this discourse is necessary for then these individuals, the citizens, to make their electoral choice, right? And like if you look at the 20th century in countries like, be it the UK, be it the Netherlands, be it Germany, France, these countries that let's say I'm familiar with, you would have like, I don't know, a few television channels, 7, 8 publications, which were centralized in the sense that like they created one common discourse. They would have maybe different ideological points of departure, but they would be talking about the same thing. And I guess what's the problem now is that we are starting having these echo chambers. That's what and that one, and that's you can see maybe already in the US, that these things are drifting, that these echo chambers are really drifting apart. They're not part of the same reality. And this, I mean, I don't want to go too far into this because I want to talk about something else, but I think that there is a real threat. I don't think that there's like to democracy. I don't think that it's by coincidence that you come up with this theme, because it was built in a certain time, this idea of democracy. I mean, once maybe 300 years ago, once in antiquity, different version, you know, and it relies on certain things. I mean, in Athens, all the men, you know, which were thought to be the, you know, let's say, a nice way of saying it's maybe thought to be the representatives of the household. In a less nice way of saying it, was thought to be those who are eligible to be a citizen, you know. They could all fit, and I'll come back to this later, they could all fit into the theater. That means they could all commune together, you know, like, and so this I think that there's a nation states, and we saw it also with the totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. In the moment you cannot commune, you know, like in an actual, I mean, a parliament is already a representation. If you go back into traditional societies, you have people like sitting in a circle debating, you know, and I've been in many of these sittings because I lived for 25 years in a communal house. And then it's a very small, and I'll come back to this at the end, it's a very small entity. So there are 15 people living there, and you have lots of problems, you know, but you can solve them all energetically. I mean, you solve them by argument, but then, like, and I mean, there's a lot of, also in philosophy, like the word thing actually comes from alting. I think a Germanic alting, and alting is actually the place you sit around when you do this kind of debating political communion, yeah? And already nation states struggle with this. We call it representative democracy because there's representatives who are then communing, not the entire society. No? And obviously centralized media also had its problems, you know, like, I mean, there were some dictators in the 20th century who really were, you know, had some ideas how to misuse them, you know, and this is always the problem with like new technologies, but more than that, new aspects in society. They're very young. Like you were talking about AI, I don't know where that's going to go. I'm not an expert, but like, of course, when something's young, people don't really know how to deal with it, and that opens opportunities for misuse or. So yeah, those are my thoughts. You know, I think it's a good topic, and that's why. And I am worried, you know, like I am worried because we used to have like, you know, if you go back to traditional societies, you have people communing, yeah, and also the idea of like a vibratory exchange is not really part of a modern rationality. Like when we sit together in a kind of round where we discuss something, maybe with 20 or 100 people, there's a vibratory consensus which happens, you know, which already in representative democracy is much more difficult because it's not everybody who's sitting there, it's the representatives who's sitting there. Now, what do you do in a global society? You know, like it's, and then the screen media, they can grasp global society, but it's very difficult to think of some kind of communion, you know. But I'll maybe come back to that at the end. So if you allow me, I wanted to talk about something a little bit more, maybe more difficult to grasp and therefore fun, but maybe also a bit abstract. But if it's not fun, you can tell me it's not fun. So which is like something that I've been fascinated, you know, like with what you can call, what is the thought style? What is the paradigm? What is the underlying algorithm of our epoch, you know? And this is something which is kind of an impossibility because it's like, let's say, a computer looking at its own kind of operating system. Like we are operating on that system, which I would call modernity or individualization, or different words for it. But what we have been socialized, how we have been programmed, you know, is something which I think is worth looking at and to understand what is its mode of operation, because somehow it's worked for a while, you know, like I think this, you know, whatever modernity, whenever it started a few hundred years ago, like my feeling is both in terms of the sustainability, the ecological crisis, as well as a certain kind of psychological crisis, run its course. It's been very successful in many things, and I'll talk about that later, but it's also somehow, like now, it's really threatening like further existence on this planet, and at the same time governments are creating ministries for loneliness, you know, and you're like, okay, wait, how do we come to a state where or a moment where a government thinks its loneliness is one of the biggest problems in society, you know? And so I would say, like, what is the culture of modernity? So modernity would be the name I chose now, like for our epoch, for our thought style, for our paradigm, for our algorithm. And how is this culture trained? Everything needs to be trained, you know? And what are its achievements and what are its shortcomings? You know, that's what I want to kind of go through a little bit in the next few minutes. And I would say the culture of modernity is a culture of separation. So I think you were using the word extraction. Extraction, I would say, like separation goes one level deeper, and I try to explain that. Extraction is a very good and important word in my opinion because it describes a lot. But at a deeper level, like the culture of modernity is an experiment in separation, which is a very unusual separation. Very unusual experiment. Like no other, like there's been many cultures in the history of humankind, different parts of the world, but no culture really made this experiment in separation. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that, because you can look at kind of any situation, any subdivision, subsector of society, you will find this principle of separation or this modality of separation at work. Like, so let me go through a little bit different aspects, different sectors of society. So let's start with the most relevant one, wisdom. You know, what we used to call wisdom in traditional societies has in modernity been split up into academic disciplines. Yeah. So like the Greeks maybe had philosophy, you know, the love of knowledge. We now have history, physics, maths, you know, all these academic disciplines, and they kind of very productive, you know, go into the depth of one little aspect of wisdom. You know? They don't really think the whole anymore, and that's been quite productive. I mean, like our society have figured out a lot of things that other societies didn't figure out, you know. And this is also going to be like, I'm always often going to try and say also the positives, you know, because I think that's a more balanced approach, you know. Like I think the reason why the culture of modernity is also, you know, has even the potential to be imperial is because it's somehow powerful in its experiment, you know. If you look at health, you know, Western, like let's say Western modernity, when it comes to health, Western modernity doesn't think of the whole body. Western modernity cuts up the body, or like separates, divides the body into different organs. So you'll have a doctor for each organ, a doctor for the heart, a doctor for the nerves, which is like the crazy one, I think, and a doctor for the bones, you know, and you have one specialized on the foot, on the throat and the nose and the ears, you know, like, So this is another example, prime example. The great philosopher Adam Smith was the first to point that out. You know, the division of labor, the productivity. You know all of this, but my aim is to show how prevalent this mode of separation is. You know, so that's why I'm going through it. Like the division of labor. That it's somehow more productive for one person to do one small thing really well, pass it on to the next person, you know, and that's still the model in which economy works to a large part, you know. A lot of the material economy, which is at the basis of, you know, our material wealth, let's say, still works like that. And the price for that, of course, in the early years of, let's say, this kind of economic society, market-based society, was like alienation, which then became like a big topic also in cultural. Now it seems like a less big topic. So you have the same principle of separation at work in the economy. You can also see it in cosmology. Yeah, so like most societies that we know in on this planet, if you look at them, they always had a relation to the otherworldly. Yeah, we separate. The otherworldly is something that we don't really put in relation to the this worldly. We're essentially a secular society. That doesn't mean the church doesn't exist. That doesn't mean that people don't believe. That doesn't mean, but the way we organize society, the way we organize science, is as if there are no higher dimensions, higher forces, Like first we assume, and there's also good reasons for that the only thing that exists is what we can perceive with the senses, And so we make this clear division. Maybe the otherworldly exists, but definitely doesn't have so much to do with us. Doesn't react with the this worldly. We are humans and we operate with the this worldly. That's the basic program of our society. Not of you, yes. It's not your program, but like that's the basic program of our society. Yeah? Is somebody raising their hand? Oh, no. No, it's good. It's good. It's a situation. And Yuri already said it. You can find the same mode of separation at work in politics. For like we have the separation of religion and state. I think historically a necessary idea. Too much abuse done by a religious leader, yielding this worldly powers. Yeah. So our civilization came up with the idea: let's separate these two things. And then first the separation is this like. How do you call it in English? Like the separation of powers, no? Like the legislative, the executive, the judiciary. It's again this model of separation. You produce like a kind of balance of powers by kind of separating them. Another aspect, maybe the most powerful, is then inventions. Research, which we call science, is based on this principle of separating whatever phenomenon it is from its normal habitat and bring it into a laboratory and seeing how one element works. How will one element which exists somehow in a network, we start looking at a microscope, in a vacuum, we try to isolate it, separate it, and see how it works. And by that we learn a lot. I mean, we learned a lot, as a culture. I wasn't part of it, but like as I'm profiting from it. So we have the same principle at work, and our science also has lots of problems when it cannot operate that way. Even truth can only be produced that way. There's lots of publications about that. Like the only real way to produce truth is to repeat it in an experiment. Valid truth in our society is because it can be repeated in an experiment. Experiment means isolating some factor which normally exists in a network, and seeing that it can kind of perform the same thing over and over again, then it must be true. We have the same modality at work in society. Well, let me talk about like my discipline first, or discipline is the wrong word, Freudian slip there. Let me talk about my subdivision of society, rituals. Yeah, like what used to be rituals. Yeah, which every society has rituals. And if you look at these rituals, how they normally work, let's say in traditional societies, historic societies, like other civilizations which existed throughout, then basically you have people come together, they dress up, they decorate the space, they somehow create music, and they somehow dance, or they talk to each other. Like, that's the basic. What we have done, and there's a great text which I recommend from Margaret Mead from the 1940s called Art and Reality, which is a scathing attack on what we have done. She calls it like a what did you call it? Like a mistake of our local European tradition. Something she has even more nasty way of saying it. But is that we have divided rituals into artistic disciplines, what we call artistic disciplines according to our senses. So we have like visual art for the eyes, visual art, you know. We have, let's say, dance somehow for what can a body do, you know. We have music, you know, for the ears, you know. And in high modernism, you know, a specific artistic moment of modernity, you should never mix these mediums, you know. Think of Clement Greenberg, if that still name still means something to anybody. But like, you know, a medium can only refer to itself, cannot be a mix. Already theater is a problem in American modernism. Why? Because it's a mix of media. It's a mix of senses. You know, don't mix the senses. You know, don't go away from the dogma of separation. You know, so and lots of interesting experiments came out of that. I mean, like what we managed to do with painting, what we managed to do with like kind of some dance forms. Like I'm a great fan of William Forsythe, for example, you know, like that's autonomous art in a specific discipline, you know, like, and lots of innovatory things have happened there. But of course, we've segregated these rituals along to the sense. We are, like Margaret Mead would say, like we're monosensical. And like a certain energetic communion comes when all the senses come together, you know, and like I think Margaret Mead says the intensity of the ritual is kind of lowered by just focusing on one sense at the time.
So, is this a conversation or a monologue?
It's now
a
right now
lecture.
it's a monologue. But if you were saying something, it's a conversation. But Yuri asked me to give a lecture, and I think he said it at the beginning.
To hear a conversation in a democratic way.
We're now listening to a lecture, which I asked Tino Sehgal to do, and if you're more in for a conversation, then go to the bar. You can converse, or listen and join in later. Yeah.
What do you want to say?
It's rude to send somebody to the bar. You know, it's not okay.
But, yeah.
I said he could choose. That's it.
No, it's rude.
Let's continue.
I warned you it's going to be a bit abstract, and I'm not going to talk about my work because it's not also not the. Huh?
It's not nice if someone breaks open a situation, actually.
Yeah. That's why I saw him. That's yeah, exactly. I agree with you. That's why I don't agree with what he's saying, but I agree with you. But that's why I also pointed to him because I saw him stand up. You know, but I tried to say something which like I said at the beginning, it's not so easy, and I think it's important to have these formats which can be maybe a bit boring, and which can try to go into the depth. And that's why I appreciate that you're allowing for these formats in an attention span. I can see in my children, which is getting smaller and smaller, no? Which again relates to these devices and the kind of principle of entertainment which are at work there. So, like, to go back to my lecture, which it is, yeah, sorry, like, I asked him 3 times, he said, yes, please, a lecture. Yesterday night at 11:15, I asked again, he said, yes, a lecture. So
Let's have it.
yeah, thank you.
It's great.
So we have the same principle at work in society or human relations, you know, and this is maybe the most difficult one to talk about. So we have, like, in society, like throughout modernity, and this is like basic sociology, we have the history or the process of individualization. What does individualization mean? It means the kind of separation of the individual from its rigid collective bonds. Yeah? And we can see the whole history of modernity, the whole history of emancipation, which, you know, in my mind is a good thing, largely, but we also have to be clear about it, it is a form of separation from rigid bonds. And it starts, so this history of individualization, you could say it's a history of freedom, it's a history of social mobility, it's a history of emancipation, kind of all points to the same thing. And maybe the first rigid bond which was separated from is that, like, in modern societies, we separated from this idea of you find you're assigned your place in society at birth, you know. So that was the first emancipation. No, like, I'm not an aristocrat, or I don't know how to say these words in English, like a peasant or something. Like, I can choose or I can work my way in meritocracy towards like the standing in society that I want, you know. Then the next thing was that you could separate / choose, had the freedom of choice to maybe go away from your religion, you know? Which was not, seems normal to us, but was not normal, you know, like that you could somehow put that into question was a process. Another step more recently is that you could separate from your family, you know. Then for my parents' generation, already a difficult thing, you could separate from your marriage, despite the vow you made, you know. Now more normal. I think the last frontier we're at now, somehow, this is maybe also controversial and difficult to talk about, but I don't want to linger on it, try to find a neutral thing, is that you can somehow separate from the constituency of your body at birth. That you can somehow choose, you know, how your body should be, or how your body can be seen. You know, that's a lot of the debate we're having at the moment. And it's again in a modern modality, you know. And so much for my long overview about trying to show that this mode of separation is at work in basically anyway. I could go on a little bit like in this room, but I'll spare you that. And I want to go back to one of the academic disciplines, which also relates to here, and I think is important, is a key one, is philosophy. You know, so if you look at philosophy, modern philosophy, you also see this principle of separation at work. What do we have? The separation of body and mind, no? Or the separation of subject and object. Like in a Kantian, I think Kant says it like maybe the strongest. Here is the subject, I am the subject, there is the world. No? And I perceive the world, and I think Kant literally says something like, but there's no connection, I can experience the world, you know? Which going back to this vibratory or energetic thing is like utterly wrong. Like from today's perspective, like that's so wrong. Like if you look into the other direction, or if you put your body different, I will feel different, you know? Or when you say, like, is it a lecture or not, makes me feel different. When you say, isn't it good to have a, you know, all of this, you know, like that, the way that you're sitting in rows, which seems anachronistic to me, but is another topic, you know, makes you feel a certain way. And so these kind of, but that's the modern, let's say, Enlightenment worldview, like here subject, here an object. But these things, of course, Kant or Descartes, these people who did this like body, mind, subject, object separations, of course they were read in their times, but I don't think it's enough for them to write like a successful book, you know? Like these things, like something like the body-mind division or the subject-object divide, they have to be trained. Like you need to train citizens to experience the world like that, you know? It's not enough to tell them, you know, like it's not enough. And so for that, we need like formats, we need rituals, and that has something to do with democracy. You know, like I think in the beginning of modernity, we were looking, or social reformers like Henry Pitt Rivers or people like that come to mind right now, like they were looking for formats, and even in Greek antiquity, rituals, formats which would be more Apollinian, more cooling down people, because that was important for, and that has, and they at the same time had the subject-object divide. So, like if you go back to antiquity, like I mean, it's a long process, and I'm not going to go so into detail. Otherwise, it's going to be even longer lecture. But like, but in theater, I mean, it was first like a half round. If you look in antiquity, became much more frontal in modern times, you know. And it's the idea, but in antiquity, it's already the same idea. You're not part. I mean, theater was part of this like Dionysiac week, the Dionysiac festival or something, no? Like a celebration. But it was important also for a democracy, and then I know more about it in modern times, that you have this outside view. So you see the drama unfold, but you're not implicated in the drama, you know? And so you are outside of the drama, which allows you to cool down instead of you would be in the midst of it and pass your judgment on it. What is the right kind of behavior? And this kind of capacity is very important if you're going to give, not let a king or queen rule, but if you're going to let citizens vote. Because on what basis are they voting? Are they voting on their affect? And of course, demagogues and populists still know how to play that piano of the affects of people. But of course, a functioning democracy relies on the capacity of judgment of its citizens. And this has to be trained, So theater is a very early or relatively early format which kind of tries to produce this distance, which is, again, like a key word, which I'm going to speak about a bit more in a second. And and you have the same thing with the exhibition. The exhibition format that I tend to work in, much younger, which starts at the same time as, let's say, our modern democracies, not by coincidence. It also performs this kind of subject-object thing. Like, here is, I am the subject, I'm viewing this painting on the wall. Or like, here's the sculpture, I'm frontal towards it, I'm not immersed. That's why, for example, the history of installation is, in my opinion, ontologically, if one is allowed to use this word here, like, important, because it somehow starts immersing, englobing people more in a network again, less practicing, training the subject-object thing, which always comes with a certain distance and comes with judgment. It's not a coincidence that Kant spoke so much about judgment, because what is your way of participating if you are confronted, if you're at a distance with something, Like when I'm dancing at a party, am I judging? No. I'm like enjoying, I'm like in a trance, or I'm excited or something, I'm not judging. If I have a distance, then I start judging, So judging is the way of participating, very Apollinian way of participating, which is also, the kind of citizen that, like, modern democracies needed for it to function. There's a caricature around the beginning times of the museum, which is very telling and has, trying to cut this short for you, but like, so the caricature can help. You see, like, the caricature has two images. One is like a mob, like there's a mob in front of a building in the background, and they're like kind of over each other, somehow drunk, like groping on each other, like a kind of Dionysiac mess. And then the second thing, you see these people inside this building, which is a museum, nicely split up into couples and individuals, going like this, And then you understand, what are these institutions about, Like, the history of art wants to make us believe that museums are about art, but there's another history, which is museum studies or sociology, which are, in my opinion, much more convincing that these places are places of training.
Discipline.
Yeah, discipline is a Foucauldian word. Yeah. But yeah, like, I would say training, like, but discipline, I think, is correct also, yeah. And all of these, so like the official formats that we have, like where we build our temples, like theaters, but now we build like the temples we really built in the centers of society. If you can look at Western countries, are museums, and they're very much still built on this cooling down. People should be, don't touch, don't speak too loud, cool down, don't be excited, and that's a culture of distance. That's very much the Western modern culture of distance, which is and this is something you asked me to talk about, like, it's a culture of the I. So I think probably, I'm not an expert, but like probably every culture prioritizes a certain sense. And in our culture, this I can say, like, we definitely prioritize the I's. So what is the I for a kind of sense, The I is the sense which reaches the furthest into the distance, yeah? If you think of the ears are much more immersive. Like, the eyes put something at a distance, they also put it, you can only look in really one direction, you can't really look to the back, So it puts you into a confrontational, more like, there's a confrontational aspect, let's say, and a distance aspect, like you can reach into the distance. I can't really smell into the distance. I can hear into the distance to a certain degree, but not as far as I can see. Could definitely not touch into the distance. And so if you compare it to hearing is much more immersive, like the sound actually enters you and goes through you. Yeah, and so we are an eye-based culture, or a culture of an eye, and like, from cinema we go to television, from television we go to the screen, and it's all in this modality of the eye. And even, these are just intuitions, but even when I see like how the event starts, you can see the culture of the screen going into our live gatherings, like then we look at the video, which 3 years ago didn't happen. We didn't look at the video if we actually meet. Or there's like, I've never been in a room with so many cameras, and the first thing that happens is that, like, I assume it's the social media department comes in and films the fact that you're there. So I'm not critiquing this, I'm just saying it's a sign of the times, The first way of showing that this thing exists is making it visually recording it, and when other times they would introduce each other, like say, like, I'm so and so or something, or just say hello, and so I think that there's also, in my opinion, something to do in our rituals, that they become more multisensory, or at least that they include other senses, which in visual art, I think visual art is has lots of shortcomings, but it also has gone in that direction, from the 60s on. Like, other senses have integrated, but the format itself, by format I mean like the architecture, the way things are shown, it's still mainly eye-centric, So, and like I said, like, let's say these both like official formats that we have, like Stadtschauburg, which is not called Stadtschauburg anymore.
Stadtschauburg, yeah. It's still called, but it's also called ITA now.
Yeah, exactly. I saw that. I was confused. But like both official formats that we have, like let's say in our region, are also funded by the state, like state theaters, state museums. They are both important for this cooling down aspect. Then the difference in them is that, like, the museum, the exhibition is a newer ritual, which is much more focused on the individuals. The first ritual we have, which is a ritual for individuals. So you can come and go when you want. You go through on your own. There's no actual gathering. And I'll come back to this later. Why was this necessary? Why are most museums, which were founded at the first big proper museums, were national galleries? It's not. Whereas theater was invented in a city, Athens. And that's not a coincidence. But I'll come to that later. So what I wanted to show is that, like, that these official institutions, these official formats that we have, they're very deeply steeped, no matter what an artist might say. Like, I can say, I'm for ecology, or I'm for the network, I'm for the interdependence, But the moment you put it into this format, you have to be aware that you're working in a format which kind of is built to train the opposite. So, my opinion, that's a fact. And so I think there needs to be, and that's what you put in the text, or Merlin put into the text, what I was going to speak about, and I am going to speak about it in a bit. But let's say, if we summarize a little bit, like, okay, we have a modality of modernity, that's the culture of separation, or the modality of separation. We find that in all of our subsectors. We find it also at work in our official rituals, What is now the advantages? What are the positives? What are the pros of this modality of modernity, of this culture of separation? Let's say, like, incredible productivity, both in terms of quantity. There's never been so many things in the world. Now we talk about the Anthropocene. Lots of innovations. We're very protected. We feel probably one of the societies which feel like most protected against the threats of nature. Now it's tilting again in the last 10, 20 years. But there was a moment where humans feel like, no humility. Somebody used this word, the princess. Humility, no humility in the 20th century. Like, we got this under control, this planet. And that's achievement first and foremost, because most cultures were concerned with that, like a freedom, large degree of freedom, like freedom to choose, and Also, relevant. I think our societies have this lowest death rate for childbirth. No, that's a real achievement which a lot of societies were dealing with. No, high level of choice. So then we come to the shortcomings, which is why we're here. We have like the culture of separation produces a certain kind of disembodiment. No, I find it interesting when you observe people's bodies. Mostly, like if I see, especially in men, I have this experience. Sorry, this is probably not politically correct, but like I find sometimes men in position of power, they have very pronounced, very articulated faces, and then you look down, and it's somehow like out of shape, no, like or out of, and or like Merline and Yuri was saying, and then they wrote me an email. Then there will be a microphone, which is again a distancing device. Why can't I speak to you like this? I mean, we're in a small room. You could feel the direct vibratory of my speech. But no, in our culture, I have to speak like this because we're recording it or because we think it's necessary, And then the other thing, they said, a lantern. I said, oh no, I never talk behind a lantern. And then I started thinking about a lantern. This is just a random example. I don't want to make a big point, but I think it's so interesting how you can find this cultural separation. So if you think of a lantern normally goes until here. So let's say I would be standing and presenting something, but the lantern, of course, it's there for me to have a text, but it's hiding my body. Because it's disembodied, because what do I do with my body? I don't, it's not like, especially as a male, you don't really move your body in our society, but you move your brain. We're brains, and like the brain is really highly valued in our society, but that's just like in Margaret Mead's way of saying it. She doesn't say it, but that's just a local bad accident, is what she said, of our particular region here. Like, no society put the brain so high. Why? Like what is high is the soul, the spirit, But we chose to take something else, Maybe we put the body also high. And another disadvantage is, and this is a proper problem now, why we're all here, is a kind of disconnection from ecological networks, Like we created all this productivity this I don't have to tell you here, but like as if we were in a spaceship and like enchanted by our own success to dominate nature, but of course it's not true. Nature showed us, or planet showed us, Mother Earth showed us, Gaia showed us, that where the real power lies, and but then there's a what the culture of separation cannot really think is like how to create bonds. If you think of freedom, and this is difficult to talk about, but freedom is always the freedom from a rigid bond. That means that all of our culture, all of us, and freedom is a value which is so highly valued that you can almost not talk about it. And I'm all for freedom. I'm an artist, But I think that it's worthwhile to look at its operating principle. It's a separation of bonds. Choice is always a separation from a commitment, from a binding. And our culture has trouble to think and create bonds. We are much more experts at dissolving bonds, and we're not committing to bonds. So, like, modernity has produced like two crises, is what I said at the beginning, The sustainability crisis, which is also a crisis of wisdom, because we cannot think the whole. The academic disciplines, and this is something like, you mentioned Bruno, the late Bruno Latour, like, this is what his work was all about. Like, the ecological crisis cannot be solved by one discipline alone, cannot even be thought by one discipline alone. So it's a clear boundary of this algorithm, of this DNA, of this operating principle of modernity. Like, it's successful, but it comes to a point where it just hits a wall. It hits the wall of its own success somehow. And then we have this psychological crisis that, like I said, we cannot think the bond anymore. And I see this also in the generation. I talk to a lot of parents who have like teenage children in their 20s, maybe children in their 30s, and they say, oh my God, they're so different than we were. all we wanted was to get away from our families, you know? Like, and what they want, they all come back. Like everybody I talk to, maybe it's a coincidence, but like they all come back all the time to their family because they realize, like, consciously or not, like, oh, this is a rare good, like a bond which is difficult to choose, to undo, you know, and they're much more related to family because they realize, like, this doesn't exist everywhere else. Like, I can be sacked, I can be not chosen, I can be, you know, dumped, you know, I can be unfollowed, you know, all of this stuff, you know. But my parents, my family, that still works under different operating principle. I also, maybe this is a random fact, but I know lots of young people who's quite stable in their relationships. Where it's not like, what? This is your first partner and you're now moving in together? Really? But they're like, oh, something in all this like fluid, what's the Polish sociologist, Polish-English sociologist, like liquid modernity, Zygmunt Bauman, you know, like in all this liquidity and all this flexibility, they're like, let me hold. There's one thing which is still like kind of doesn't work under this principle. Let me hold on to it, you know. And so then we come to the actual topic of the. And so I thought a little bit about this. Okay, so we have a problem with modernity, problem with this culture of separation, but our rituals are really steeped in it. How can we? And this comes back to your question, like, but we as cultural people of culture, we also have a responsibility, like you said in your opening remarks, you know, like we can't leave it just to the politicians or to the other sectors, you know. We have to create in our sector things which also overcome modernity, and that's less easy than you think. And we started some initiatives like 10 years ago with UNESCO, with EU, and we thought like, let's try to make like a new kind of format, you know, which is somehow a mix of, you know, takes the advantages of the theater and the advantages of the exhibition and some new elements and puts them together and tries to get out the negative elements. And I have to say, like, as sad as it sounds, like most people didn't understand what we were talking about and said that they were interested, but in the end nobody wanted to fund like a kind of new kind of Kunsthalle for the UN or for the EU. You know? I worked with Hans-Ulrich Obrist together on this, and we failed. No? Like, and Hans-Ulrich Obrist, I don't know if you know him, is a curator. He's leading his profession, you know, like. So
he's the main curator in Europe. Yeah.
And so, but what would be I can talk about this more concretely, but let's say what would be, like, we've tried to say, like, you know, against all this backdrop of the issues of the modern algorithm, what would be criteria for new ritual, which kind of leads us into a 21st century society, which is not a modern society anymore? How would that have to be? So one criteria would be what I call porosity. So if you look at, especially museums, but same is true for theater, they're very much like what Bruno Latour, coming from Whitehead's, calls this like bifurcation of nature and culture, you know, like, or bifurcation of natures. So it means that we have this strong division between culture and nature. I won't go into this, but like it's what Bruno means when he says we have never been monoid, means like we have never, actually culture and nature have never been divided, but we pretended to do so and it was effective, but that's another lecture. And so this division between nature and culture is something that you find manifested in our institutions. Like, Raimundos, I don't know if you've tried to open a window in a museum. You will have like a kind of upheaval. Like, I've tried, like, no, nothing from the outside can come inside. Even the air cannot come inside. The air has to be processed with lots of energy, carbon consuming, you know, like, created new air with this, like, with 50% humidity and 20 degrees, you know, before it can be sent into the exhibition halls, you know, and for conservation's sake, which is actually even not true, but that's another lecture, and so this kind of porous, like a new ritual, like, has to be more porous between inside and outside, you know, has to be able to let plants in, other species in some way or another, even maybe even just visually, I don't know, but like there has to be a little bit more porosity. Maybe like Japanese garden houses or something are maybe a good reference point, you know. Then I think another point is that it has to be, it's more difficult to explain, but like more time-based. So one of the innovations of the exhibition was, as a fairly new ritual, 200 years old, is that there's no real development in time. Like you look at an object, and the object is still, you know, and that's a weak bond, and that was wished for. Like you have a weak bond with an object because A, it's an object. Yeah, I mean, an object which is not part of your everyday life. You just look at it standing for a second. And this weak bond is important for democracy also, because it's not like a master-student relation or like a human-to-human relation where you have to be polite, where you can be indoctrinated. Like, no, there's this object, never talks back. You can pass your judgment on it. So it trains you to give your individual, judgment. Yeah, and but it stays also very cool. Very Apollinian, you know. And the moment you show a video, you produce some neuroscientists say we are the narrative animal. Sometimes you create a dramaturgy. Then there's also like a stronger relation, a stronger reaction also that happens. And what I've been trying to do, and other people, and you have in a theater in a model-like setting, but not in a real actual interaction, is human-to-human relations. You know, like at the end, humans relate to humans much stronger than they relate to looking at objects. You know, and also this celebration of the object, you know, started in the 19th century in exhibitions at the same time where industrialism took off. You know, that's not a coincidence. Then I think what another criterion would be that it keeps this. Like, although it has a human-to-human relationship, there has to be an element of choice, which means like keeping an element of the exhibition, you can come and go as you want. Like the audience, the public in a theater is already too rigid of a collective. It's like a collective body. You form a collective body. We're individualizing you by the fact that. Or you're individualizing yourself by the fact that you say something. But first of all, the format produces you as a collective. Like the lights are on Yuri and me and not on you. I tried to change that, I failed. But later when you talk, more individualizing will happen. But the format itself produces you as a collective body. Like then this gentleman managed, you know, to extract himself from this collective body, which is a good thing, you know, like it's a liberal world, you know. And I think that's also, you know, that's what I think Yuri was also alluding to. It's a free world, like we live in liberalism, you know, there's choice, abundance of choice. One of the choices is to leave this room. And then another thing I think like a new ritual should be on a spectrum. Like now our rituals are like very much on the spectrum of beholding, receiving, judging, and very little on the level of like actively engaging your body, your speech, your voice, no? And that doesn't mean that everything should be participatory. There's a beauty in contemplation, but there should be a bigger spectrum, a more choice of how to, here the freed God sees, or you could take this seat. Then make us happy, you and me. Look, we're really eager. Yeah, welcome. And so this that there's more reflection also of how society works, where like through voting, through our decisions of what we buy, through social media, we're often in a more active role. Like I also see with the younger generation, again, it's just an intuition, just a personal observation, that they don't relate so much to this idea that they just receive something. They're used to always giving like some kind of like or comment or something. You know, like the idea that you're just receiving is a bit confusing to them, because that's actually something they don't really know in life. you know. And I think that the formats have to reflect that. And you know, one of my most known works, it was also shown at the state, like this progress is like a conversation with 4 different generations. You speak with a child, so that's where basically the visitors co-create the work. And this was also a problem for some critics, you know, like I remember when I first showed the work in 2006, you know, a critic said, but was really offended, like, and left the work and said, like, how can I review this if I'm co-creating it, you know? And those are 2 different models of like how to understand a ritual act, you know, not use the word art. And so let's say if there were, so these are like, let's say, qualitative, and then I'm slowly coming to the end, Yuri, but like these are qualitative criteria, you know, the porosity, time-based, human-to-human relation, opening hours, like, which people can come and go, but maybe produces temporary collectives. You know, like, this is something that's quite subtle, but like there's more and more, not many, but there's exhibitions which make people congregate, you know, like I don't know if you, Raimundos, if you saw Philippe Parino's 2011 Serpentine show, then a film would start, people would stay there. My work, it often happens, people congregate for a while, they look at something, then something else happens, but these people are not, it's not such a big act to leave the room. Like everybody is somehow leaving at some point, coming at some point, because there's no appointment, you know, like I would say, you know, theater operates in the modality of appointment, like here, like this is an appointment event, you come at 8, right? Exhibitions are more opening hours, like shopping malls, like stores, you can come and go at any moment. And in a way, I think what we have to create is like a mix of these 2. Maybe the Balie is a good example. You can be in the cafe, but then you can also choose to, like, it's already a mix of these modalities, and I think we need more of that. But so my last point is that these are qualitative criteria, which I just tried to resume. Also, this or summarize this active-passive thing is another of these qualitative criteria. But we do have a real problem of size or quantity, you know, and that's always been the problem as societies got larger. This has always been a problem, how to create rituals which can gather a society, because for a society to constitute itself, the society needs to come together and enact its values, like almost bodily, you know. And for example, an example that I like to give is, for example, the Sabar ritual, which you can find in Senegal. And so it happens like the people of a certain area, a certain village, they come together, they put chairs around, the men make music, and everybody else sits, and then they can choose the women, nowadays sometimes also the men, they run into the center of this circle, and then they do this kind of very beautiful air dance where they just touch the floor quickly. And so, but my point is, like, I could go on like explaining or talking about Sabar, but my point is that everybody from this district or from this village can participate in this ritual. I saw once like a 13-year-old girl from a certain street stand up, and everybody was like, including me and my friend, were like, oh my God, she's standing up. She's going to do it. She's like 12 or 13. And everybody from her street was like freaking out because she was going to show herself and show the street or represent the street, represent her peer group. And so that's easy. You know, and in most traditional societies, you can find one way or another. People congregate, like what I talked about at the beginning, the alting or something. And then when you come to a city, it's already more difficult. You know, like the theater in Athens housed 17,000 people. 17,000 was exactly the number of men that existed in Athens, you know, which were then... but then, like, if you look at stadiums, you know, there's no really stadiums that we know which are more than 100,000. So what do you do with a nation? Nation is like, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 million or more. you cannot congregate this society anymore, you know? And as a ritual, this is a real problem. So what modern times came up with was a kind of like, okay, if you look at, for example, the Louvre, one of the first museums, it's like it belongs to the French people, like it's a fact, and every French person, over the course of some years, over the course of their life, can go through the Louvre, you know? And in this moment, they can say, French citizen. These are all very subtle things and difficult to grasp, maybe, but nonetheless, they're real, you know. Like, and that's why, like, all of these nation states, like the UK, France, Germany, around the same decades, in a matter of 10 years, they all built up these national galleries, you know. So then, what you do when you come to the EU or Europe, or you're talking about a global society, becomes a real problem. Like, how do you gather? And that's why I'm also like, why I immediately said yes, you know? It's a real problem. How do we even understand ourselves as part of planet Earth? And this is what we talked with the UN 10 years ago. We said, like, there needs to be a place, in our opinion, where you can go and you can officially feel like I am part, like now I'm entering a place which belongs to the world, to the planet, you know? Or how do you experience the EU? I have to go into a place where this is a European place. And so our idea was to create like a format where there would be different live events happening, different artistic disciplines, like mix. So it wouldn't be centered on one thing. You could come and go at any time. You could also know, like, okay, similar to here now in this room, this is happening, you know, but I can also be in the bar or like an exhibition or something and experience that in an opening hours kind of way. But then this thing would be, an entity by the EU or by the UN, and then travel. So people in, I don't know, Hong Kong would see the same program or a similar program as people in Amsterdam, as people in Johannesburg. You know, so that this program would travel, and so this would, we wrote texts about it. We had like different meetings. We tried a little bit with the EU, but there was little response. With the UN, we had a lot of contact, but in the end, also, I think there was a lack of. There was no. I mean, UNESCO doesn't actually have money, which we were naive. We didn't understand that. But also there's a lack of understanding, you know, like why do we even need rituals? Because these rituals that train us, they're so normalized, and that's why I like to talk about them, even if it's abstract or lengthy. Like they are so normalized that we think it's normal. We think it's normal that you sit in rows like that. But why are you sitting in rows? What is this trying to perform? I don't have the answer. I mean, I could come up with an answer, but I'm trying to close now because now I have talked for more than an hour. But like, it's not a coincidence that you're sitting in straight lines, you know? And we could talk about that later. But and so I like to point to these things because I think these things exactly because they're not so visible, because they have been normalized, they are even more effective and important, you know. And so as we're trying to look for a new society, we have to think about these things too. But it's not easy. Like I went down that road. I mean, I managed to do it in my own work. But if you try to do it on the level of institutions, people are like, I did a project. We did like a small version of this kind of new format in New York. And one of the rules was like it was more with people. We had like concerts, a school, my work, Foresight's work, like, but all on a platform, so you could never have this subject-object division, you know. And then there was lots of resistance in the institution. At some point, I remember, like the technical director, they'd found one event by a pop star where they could create a stage. Well, that was the rule. There cannot be a stage. There cannot be this division, you know. This kind of my sister's a philosopher. She would say a two-world ontology, you know. With one world, this is another world, you know. The technical director said, so let's say this is the stage, you know? And these things are so ingrained, you know, very difficult to work against them. Like to a certain degree, you know, I have less energy for them, but that's why I'm happy to talk about them than I had 10 years ago, but there we are.
Thank you very much. wonderful lecture. You covered a lot of ground, and you are. What I liked many things about it, and one of them is that you said Apollonian rituals, they're cool in many ways. They're cooling down, but they're also cool. Maybe they're about cooling down, and we've been doing those things for centuries, for a very, very long while. And you give the idea that you're pointing to, because if you want new rituals for our time, which, if you want to heal maybe or overcome the separation we've been doing for centuries, maybe 2,500 years at least, and modernity even much quicker, of course, the whole project of modernity. So would you advocate for more Dionysian rituals which sort of throw things more together and make you more intense instead of cooling down and separating your senses in order not to be touched as a whole?
It needs a balance. Yeah, I think that also our democracies were very successful in cooling people down, and but not sure to which degree it's still necessary. That's I mean, I've tried a little bit in my work. This variation, which was acquired by the Stedelijk, is like people dancing, singing in an exhibition room in the dark. So you're in a vibratory exchange, or also have to think of Carsten Höller's work, who maybe a bit of a ready-made, but who builds these slides into museums, and people just, their judgment is totally, I'm not saying this is like the greatest work of art, but it's an interesting kind of this conversation. People are just like screaming and like experience their bodies, and there's definitely no time to judge. Later they can judge, but the moment like gravity takes you, you cannot judge. I think it's a lot about balance, like I'm not against a culture of separation in and of itself. I think it's done a lot of good things, but it's definitely out of balance and needs to be balanced. So I'm not saying that like all rituals should not be 100% Dionysian, but I question the fact that like they need to be so cool, and it has again to do with a secular society that like we cannot think the transcendental, we cannot think trance, we cannot think some kind of divine or even energy or vibratory, but we are vibratory beings. It's just that modernity, also like science cannot or could not for a long time now probably, I'm not an expert, it's at a different place, but like it was difficult to measure vibration, difficult to measure energy passed between people, So that logic of our society didn't exist until some quantum physicists say it does exist and proves it in a laboratory experiment. Then it exists. It's like, yeah, okay. But other cultures already knew that it exists and we already felt it, But it's not legitimate in our society, which is okay, but it's not that intelligent,
We're saying we live in the Anthropocene because what did it bring us? This culture of separation. It brought us a lot of stuff. We produced huge amounts of stuff, things. In the summer, I was at the Renzo Piano Museum of Natural History, built by Renzo Piano in Trento. And to my amazement, there are rock formations exhibited, which consisted of layers of plastic and rock. Real rock formations they cut out of several, and according to the text next to it, it's a feature of Anthropocene that there's many places on Earth which are already geological formations are forming with plastics in them, which is amazing to see. It's the end. It's stuff, but relating to your work, you don't make stuff. Is that sort of an answer to that, or that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, try to make this short, but yeah, I felt that there's like an overemphasis on what level of well-being can be derived from the production and consumption of things. That doesn't mean I'm against the production or consumption of things. I think that like a certain level of material wealth definitely goes a long way in your well-being, but after you hit a certain point, like the graph kind of starts plateauing, and I think that younger generations have a sensitivity for that. That's my optimistic impression, maybe too optimistic, but they understand, like growing up in the 80s, like there was a lot of the culture, like, if I just buy this or that, if this or that car, like then that will, give me status, that will give me relations, and that will give me, happiness, and all that equation. I feel like younger generation doesn't really buy into that. They're not so interested in cars, for example, which I find fascinating. And I also encounter younger people who are quite distant. I mean, a lot of them addicted, maybe the majority, and I think we're all addicted to the phone, or most of us. But I also experience people who really understand it and say, like, I don't need this so much in my life, And so my work was definitely an answer to a thing where I think, like, this equation, we transform natural resources or transform our planet into things, and then that will make us happy. I was like, I don't see that. I think there's something deeper at work which is neglected, and let me try to work on that a little bit. The most, like I like to say as an artist, when I'm my artist hat on, like, which I was happy not to have today. Thank you, Yuri. Is I like to work with the most complex medium on this planet, which is, in my opinion, still humans. No.
Mm-hmm. Still humans talking to each other, or being each other present, or moving. Bodies moving in each other's presence.
Moving. I mean, you're moving nicely right now,
Mm-hmm.
but I could choreograph that a little bit. Yeah, but we could work on that. I'd like to, we could make this into rehearsal, but then
it looked like
then it goes from a lecture to a rehearsal. But
looked like there was a stroboscope, actually.
Yeah. What I was doing. Yeah. But. Yeah, it's for me. It's interesting to. I was really excited, like maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I learned this word from Foucault, because you use the Foucauldian term, like technologies of the self or techniques of the self. And I was like, I grew up in a society where there was a lot of production. I mean, I grew up in this real industrial center, blah, blah, blah. But like, it was technology, like, that's the end all, the maker of history, like what will make us happy. And I was like, oh, really? And then I read Foucault, it's like technologies of the self. Like yes, you do meditation, or like another example is like friendship. Like that's a technology of the self, according to Foucault, writing a diary, like these ways of working on yourself. I think my opinion also, that now that I'm a bit older, at the end of the day, that's what life is about. And that is actually what remains. What remains is your experiences, and that's what you take with you according to, wisdom traditions, but also to like near-death research. What we take with us is our experiences in this life.
Yeah, I think what you said about musea as sort of an example of what our modern society tries to do, and overcoming that in order to heal maybe heal society, or stop us hurting the planet, or killing the planet, or is that you described that we should look for ways in which we overcome that sort of separation, instead of making musea which are more open, and which are not a museum but a place of coming together and meeting each other.
Yeah, more human-to-human relations, but also not neglecting all of the innovations. I mean, because there's opening hours, which seems like a random fact, but it isn't.
No, it's not.
Like lots of people can follow through this thing. Like it's an interesting figure is that more people, like I think in Germany or UK, I can't remember, like more people go to museums than go to a football stadium. First you think like, oh really? But it's true, because a football stadium is big, but 80,000 people fit in like once every 2 weeks. But all of these museums, small and big, they're open like 10 to 6 every day. And there's a kind of throughput, if you want to use that word, And that's the modality of opening hours that can accommodate, and that's exactly like it's a reflection of democracy. This doesn't come from me. This is like museum studies, 101 somehow. Museums or exhibitions manage to accommodate lots of people, like let's say, millions over years, but as individuals. That's exactly what a modern democracy does. It accommodates millions in its nations, but still wants to treat them as individual. Like you're sovereign of your own body, one person, one word, etc. pp. And so in that sense, the exhibition is a clear indicator. We're a productivist society. What does our ritual do? Show what we can produce. Like if it's now artistic or not, it's always a product. Like it's no coincidence that our ritual does that. Question is like, how long do we want to continue to celebrate that in that way?
And you sound pretty optimistic if I listen to you about sort of the end of the operating system we've been curating or developing for at least the project of modernity, which starts somewhere maybe with the coming of the printing press or somewhere in late Renaissance or early Renaissance. But you sound in a way very optimistic that we could overcome. But it becomes, we've talked this earlier many on the phone several times. But of course the separation goes more and more. Because listening to your lecture and listening to you, talking to you, this separation, which puts a sort of a veil between everything we do, which you might call, I don't know, the Hindus called it Maya, a goddess, which is, or Plato called it the cave idea of Plato, where we see only shadows. But it actually, there's an extra veil. So the separation, like you eloquently described, is going actually much further recently. So I don't really see an end to it. I see much more.
It's also training. I'm very worried also with my children. And I think you had a better way of expressing. You said like it produces a veil. How to and to Corona, I think also pandemic emphasized or like furthered that. And I could also experience it myself, because I think when you come into an energetic relation with somebody in some kind of like energetic vibratory communion or exchange, there's a certain social, like we have the word social anxiety, like and so I think what used to happen before, so what this device allows you, social media allows you, YouTube, etc., it allows you to have social like, or quasi-social, your social needs are kind of quasi-fulfilled without the price of that you have to overcome your anxiety. And that's, I think, a real problem. So, like, you can, like, because, I mean, Gerhard Schulze, like the German sociologist, also, like, talked about, like, in let's say, older, feudal, village, rural societies, there's very little newness. So there's a lot of gossip because people are like hungry for the new, And I can still remember a time where you could be bored, And what do you do when you're bored? You go out, you start talking to people, like, or randomly remember the story about Machiavelli, not the nicest guy in history, but Machiavelli's operating principle was like he would walk down the road and he would ask everybody, "What's the news? What do you know?"
At the inn, not too far from his house.
Yeah. And so, those were times where, you were trained to overcome the social anxiety. I experienced it myself. I'm like, am I going to ask somebody for the way? Oh no, I'm in my hyper-individualized space, like so many people around, like Google Maps, but it energetically, it's not good. Like I have a spiritual teacher, and I had like kind of a long distance relationship, and I spent a lot of time about Skype. And she said to me, "Yeah, but you're not actually communicating, because energetically you're not in vibration. Like I'm still I'm talking to another person, through a video call." But at the same time, it doesn't produce a vibratory communal experience. At the end of the day, energetically, on a quantum level, I'm alone in my room. And after a while, you feel it, And that's, like, I was just working with a person from Utrecht, young person, teenager. And we didn't talk much because her English is not so good, but she said to me, like, I said, there was a time where where I had to go and stand in line for 45 minutes to buy a train ticket. And she looked at me and she says, "That was good. That might be better." You know, she looked at me, the 17-year-old. I was like, oh yeah, like she understands. Like we didn't talk more about it, but she's like, she understands. She's a digital native. She understands somehow intuitively the dangers of this. But like with my younger son, for example, I'm very worried. Like it's heavily addicted. Like I say it every day, but I'm not sure. I'm not a good parent. I don't know how to control it. You know, and like the other day, I said there were people at our house, and it's the most basic thing. And he's in his room, and I say, now you're going out. Please say bye to the people. No, why should I? They don't care. Like, why should, no. Like they're not trained to overcome a certain social anxiety out of curiosity, you know, like, and curiosity was a driving force, but like you can still your curiosity. I mean, like YouTube is amazing. You can look into other people's life at your own choice. I mean, another word for our society would be choice society or selection society, which is great, but always also, you know, anyway, I'm not going to repeat my lecture, but choice is great, but you have to understand it's always the opposite of a commitment. Choice is always like the possibility to undo a commitment, but commitment deepens relationships. I don't know where my position is. I agree with you that this is a real veil because it kind of makes you get, it's like a drug. I mean, not in the sense that it's addictive. Yes, it is addictive. Also. But it gives you the feeling without actually giving you the experience or something. And that's why it's dangerous, you know, because at the end you do feel a little bit empty. You know, I would say I was also, when YouTube, like, for a while, it was really fascinating. I was like, I can look into all these subfields I don't know anything about. I know my field, but what are these other people doing? You could look at them at work. I was like, wow, what are they doing? You know, like this is much more interesting than talking to the people I already know. But then after a while, I realized, feels a bit empty somehow, you know. Yeah, let's open it up. Yeah.
Yes, let's do.
So first of all, I'm here because I don't know, I think your work in the past has really moved me in this progress and this separation. That's why I came.
I give you a dividing device because otherwise people at home I keep it for you.
Yeah, I find this evening a bit contradictory. I hear quite some nostalgia for public sphere, in ancient Greece and maybe the Habermasian public sphere, which by the way was mostly men who participated in those. Also in Senegal, the example you gave. But then, and we have museums where people are not really invited to participate. But then the beginning of the evening when, this man who I happen to know, by the way, that's maybe also why I said something. Disrupted the situation and maybe invited a more communal conversation. It closed down. And I'm curious if we can, if you wish, reflect on that a bit further. Maybe not on a particular moment, but what would a communal conversation look like nowadays then?
I tend to agree with you. That's why I asked you 3 times, what are we doing? But I'm a guest, you know, and I'm a professional guest. So I try to be a good guest. So I follow the rules. I pointed out that you're all sitting in lines. But I also think that like in the future or like we need an ecology of different formats. And like I said at the beginning, like I agree with what you say, like, and one could do this much more communally. But I think there's also, you know, Yuri or Merline, they made the decision to invite me to speak about certain things. And I think there is a value in going in depth, you know. And, but yeah, when I do my work, I do it differently, yeah. But also my work, like I've done very different things. Like I've done pieces like this Progress where the visitor has like 50% of the say. And that's my main focus also. Like I like to do this, but it's not what I would do as my main activity. And but there's also other works where you do just watch. I mean, like, and there's nothing you can change. It's a fixed choreography, even, you know, like, and I've done that at the beginning, like 20 years ago, but I still also do it now, you know, like pieces which are really absorbed and which, you know, hopefully absorb you in. So it's more about like a pluralism of modalities, but in principle, I agree with you. Like I always like to kind of react to it. It was just not what we announced at the beginning, like, and also, what Yuri asked me for, you know. Other questions or comments?
Well, you were talking about the separation and the Kant, and I had to think about Jung's philosophy on individuation, with what kind of it's a kind of a separation, and individuation leading to getting closer to Jung's philosophy. I could say maybe we're not separated enough to go into our communal conscious. And sometimes I felt like separation and addiction a bit of mixed up. So for me, I found looking at it's more an addiction than a separation. It's not a real separation. So I think there are some mixed up, and for me at least, different terms.
I mean, you spoke about Carl Gustav Jung, no? You said Jung, because at first I heard Hume.
No, Jung. Carl Gustav, yeah.
I think that's a good question. When I say individualization, that's more sociological. Yeah, it's more like, so individualization, my opinion, means I understand myself first and foremost as myself. I don't understand myself as the husband of, or as a French person, or as a Catholic. Like in other times, people want to understand them first and foremost as a Catholic, or as a member of this, as a French person, or as a member of this family, you know? And individualization is a process where increasingly, like, I experience myself as the base unit. Then what Jung talks about in terms of individuation, you know, is, in my opinion, something slightly different, you know? And it's like maybe freeing yourselves from the archetypes, no? Or like understanding what archetypes are governing you. This maybe you know better than me. But that's an inner process, yeah, which can happen if you understand yourself as part of a group first and foremost or not. I don't know if a Buddhist monk understands themselves as an individual in the way a modern Westerner understands themselves as a, you know, but they're still going probably through this process of individuation. But it's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer.
Tino, first of all, thank you so much for the talk. It was really, really interesting, and I really enjoyed going deeper into a subject. I don't think we do a lot of it these days. I was curious about some things you said. So we can say the things like museums are training for democracy, or theater is a training for democracy, because it allows us to judge things not in an emotional way, but as you said, to use judgment. So we can say that could be a good thing because it encourages democracy. At the same time, and we say also that the separation is increasing now, also what we were saying now with phones and all of that. But at the same time, we also see, I think there's a general feeling of democracy that is under attack, let's say, because of a group that is, let's say, they're not following these traditional rules of judgment, but rather they are, you know, again, they're going into this kind of hot, let's say, emotion. So how do we resolve these two things? Are we not separating enough, or do certain people need to separate more? Or that's, I guess that's my getting your thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have a good answer, but what I meant when I said, like, these institutions were built, you know, like both in antiquity and then in modern times, you know, to cool down people, to kind of train a kind of a good judgment, you know, because how can you build a democracy if everybody is affected? And then I was interviewed by an Israeli newspaper a few weeks ago, and it was kind of difficult for me to speak about these things, but I did. They were asking me about the state, you know, there, and I said, also what happened in the US, like a few years ago, you know, like there's people who've managed to crack the code of, like, democracy. Like, how do you undo it? Like, and that is very concerning. It seems like more and more people have figured out how to crack this code, and probably has something to do with social media, and like you say, like, playing to these hot affects, then undoing certain institutions. And but this is something I don't feel comfortable talking about, like, in such a setting, because yeah, I don't know so much about them. You know, but when I talk about these things, about judgment stuff, it's more historically why, like just to recall, why were these institutions even built, you know? Like, I mean, just going into it again for a sentence, you know, then the National Gallery in London was built exactly between the East and the West End because they had this problem that on Mondays the men were drunk and there was a big productivity loss. So they're trying to find a place where like the working classes could go on the weekend with their wives and also emulate but the higher classes would also go. They wouldn't necessarily actually interact, but they could see each other or like the working lower classes could like emulate that behavior, you know, like there's real like social training reasons for these institutions to exist, you know, like this sense of judgment is just one. Thank you for coming.
You have the last question.
Thanks. Tino, you are talking, and we are a culture of the eye, but I'm also looking a lot at the photo behind you.
Oh, yeah, I didn't even see that, yeah.
And I keep on wondering, and I've never experienced your life, so I hope this is not an inappropriate question. But to take part in a ritual and to recreate the bonds, you have to be able as a human to do that. What do you do with people, whether it is performers or audience, that are fundamentally afraid of other people?
Yeah, yeah. First of all, there's no real photos of my work, but like now we're outside the art world, and like people at the Balie, like I've never been in a situation, Raimundas, where like there was a photo of my work behind me. I didn't even realize, so that's a first after 22 years, but all good, Yuri. Next time, if you invite me again, we'll do it differently. But I had this, like to just answer from my personal experience, like I had this problem of like this fear of interaction more with people who were really professional at the art game, like who were like critics, curators, who would be like, wait, I don't want to, like I'm so used to playing my judgment game. I'm a great player at this aesthetic judgment game. I don't want to be engaged or something, you know, like that would happen on a regular basis like 10, 15, 20 years ago, you know. Now I don't experience that so much. I experience more this, let's say, to say it quickly, this prosumer attitude that people can be quite happy to engage, you know, like in a quick format. But I'm also not always there when my work is shown. I mean, like, this work in the dark, I hear that a lot of people are like then, but it's more the dark, you know. Maybe it would be better I'd have to ask some people who like set up the works and are there longer than me, but don't really experience that problem so much anymore for whatever reason.
We leave it at that. Thank you very, very much for your expose. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for trusting me that it was a lecture, and for engaging in talks over the past weeks and months, and trusting us to come and share your thoughts in an unknown place. Always unexpected things could happen and will happen. That's the wonderful thing of being live and in each other's presence. Thank you very much for being in our presence and coming along. I think what you hinted at, the operating system of our society and how we could maybe try to balance that a little bit, looking for rituals and ways to change art, because art is one of the parts of, you know, we should be doing this, and you are already for a very long while doing that, inspiring other ways of looking at coming together and organizing things which we might call art, or wonderful that you mentioned Hans Ulrich Obrist, that you try to do this sort of European or United Nation even sort of ritual. What he did at the Serpentine Gallery, having long conversations of marathons, we imitated it from him and did some 12 hours marathon, people coming in and out, and it creates a totally different atmosphere of being, there's no end and there's no beginning, and people can shift in and out and drift in and out. We're trying to do that sort of experimenting. That's what we did tonight as well. Thank you for doing that with us, and till next time. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for coming.